Olá a todos. Primeiro eu queria agradecer-vos em nome do Clube de Lisboa estarem connosco, estarem connosco neste painel. Queria também relembrar que temos tradução simultânea, porque o painel vai ser em português e em inglês, e se precisarem deste tipo de tradução, aqui na plataforma Zoom, no canto inferior direito tem a interpretação e podem clicar aí e traduzir. So now in English, thank you very much for being here with us today. I would like to thank you on the behalf of Clube de Lisboa, and I would like also to inform you that as the panel is going to be both in English and in Portuguese, we have simultaneous translation. So you just need to click on the bottom right of your Zoom platform to access it. Agora vou passar para o português e vou fazer a apresentação do painel em português. Este painel é sobre o papel das tecnologias e a aceleração do desenvolvimento tecnológico e o impacto que essa aceleração tem nas nossas vidas, tanto enquanto sociedades, como depois esta aceleração das alterações tecnológicas impacta as dinâmicas internacionais. Connosco temos o Pedro Saleiro. O Pedro Saleiro é investigador na FEDSAI, uma empresa que está sediada em Lisboa, e temos a Chloe Tivan, que é investigadora no European Center for Development Policy Management em Maastricht. Vou só explicar um pouco como é que o painel se vai desenvolver. Eu primeiro vou pedir a cada um que se apresente e que façam primeiro uma pequena introdução inicial de cerca de 10 a 15 minutos, e vamos começar o nosso debate. Por isso eu encorajo todos a participar e podem fazê-lo através da secção do Q&A também na plataforma Zoom ou através do YouTube. E por isso vamos dar início ao painel. Eu peço ao Pedro Saleiro que, por favor, se apresente e que nos fale um bocadinho daquilo que faz e de que forma é que aquilo que faz está relacionado com o nosso painel de hoje. Obrigada.
Antes de mais, boa tarde a todos. É um prazer estar aqui, não fisicamente, mas através de videoconferência, a discutir aqui aspectos relacionados com a aceleração tecnológica e o impacto nas nossas vidas. Queria desde já também agradecer ao Fernando Jorge Cardoso o convite endereçado e aqui para mim uma oportunidade também de sair um pouco de um público de nicho mais tecnológico e tentar passar um pouco uma mensagem e fazer uma reflexão mais, digamos assim, de vasto alcance em relação ao impacto da tecnologia na nossa sociedade. Para me apresentar um pouquinho, posso dizer que tenho doutoramento na Faculdade de Engenharia da Universidade do Porto em Machine Learning, ou seja, relacionado com a inteligência artificial. Daí segui para um pós-doc na Universidade de Chicago, onde trabalhei com Raed Ghani, ex-Chief Scientist da campanha do Obama 2012, em trabalhos de aplicação de Data Science ou ciência de dados em problemas de políticas públicas para fins de grande impacto social. Como é que nós podemos utilizar os dados, a inteligência artificial, para melhorar condições e ajudar organizações de políticas públicas em processos decisórios e a uma alocação mais eficiente dos recursos disponíveis. Aí nós percebemos que havia uma necessidade de não só desenvolver sistemas de inteligência artificial com fins utilitários, mas também do ponto de vista de discriminação e objetivos de equidade social. Desenvolvemos uma plataforma chamada Equitas, que foi a primeira plataforma disponível totalmente livre, open source, para a auditoria de sistemas inteligentes em relação à discriminação de género, de idade, de sexo, de vários outros tipos de atributos, de forma a fomentar a auditoria da inteligência artificial e o desenvolvimento da inteligência artificial com objetivos também de equidade e não apenas de eficiência. Dito isto, aqui para a minha intervenção inicial vai ser baseada num livro que recomendo a todos, chamado Possible Minds. Foi publicado em 2019 e é uma reflexão sobre um outro livro de 1950 chamado The Human Use of Human Beings, de Norbert Wiener. O Wiener, nesse livro de 1950, previu o desenvolvimento da inteligência artificial. Estamos a falar há 70 anos atrás. E que esta não só iria imitar os humanos e substituí-los em várias atividades inteligentes, mas também que iria mudar os humanos nesse mesmo processo. Wiener receava que os humanos, ou uma estrutura organizacional, pudessem abusar dessa capacidade tecnológica para subjugar outros humanos, ou que líderes políticos tentassem controlar as suas populações através desta capacidade, mas de uma forma subtil. Envolvidos 70 anos, estamos numa situação bem mais complexa do que Wiener antecipou, sobretudo em dois aspectos concretos. Em primeiro lugar, o Wiener não previu a vulnerabilidade dos nossos sistemas computacionais. Tinha um background muito físico e não antecipou que os sistemas digitais fossem tornar-se muito semelhantes aos sistemas biológicos. E tal como os sistemas biológicos fossem vulneráveis a ataques de entidades minúsculas, intrusas, como os vírus. E a realidade é que hoje em dia dependemos de computação para praticamente tudo. A nossa infraestrutura de eletricidade, gás, estradas, automóveis, comboios, aviões, vulneráveis a ataques digitais. A banca e o sistema financeiro. As nossas poupanças, as nossas hipotecas, vulneráveis a ataques digitais. O nosso entretenimento, comunicação, a nossa segurança física, o nosso consumo de informação sobre o mundo que nos rodeia, os próprios sistemas de voto, todos vulneráveis. E isto não é passível de ser melhorado no futuro próximo e, portanto, vários aspectos da nossa sociedade estão suscetíveis a ataques malignos, tanto por criminosos freelancers, como nações ou estados adversários. O segundo aspecto que o Wiener não previu foi que a computação hoje em dia não se limita a funções. Não é um conjunto de instruções, o programa executa e fornece um resultado. Não. A computação hoje em dia tem um estado online perpétuo, alimentado pela nossa pegada digital. E, portanto, a máquina é capaz de fazer inferências sobre o humano através das várias interações que este tem com este. Quanto mais interações, mais informação a máquina tem sobre os seus utilizadores. Este paradigma é ainda mais exacerbado quando, em vez de um programa, temos um ecossistema de várias aplicações a partilhar estes sinais entre si. E hoje em dia, posso dar alguns exemplos, e com certeza no painel de discussão podemos também ir mais a fundo, coisas como inferir o género ou a idade de uma pessoa é trivial. Inferir a personalidade, ou até mesmo os nossos anseios mais secretos, os nossos medos, é trivial hoje em dia. Os smartphones são verdadeiros cavalos de Troia que capturam a nossa privacidade sem darmos por isso. É esta capacidade das empresas tecnológicas em comoditizar os metadados recolhidos da nossa interação digital com fins lucrativos, para fins publicitários. Shoshana Zuboff apelidou de Surveillance Capitalism. A inteligência artificial e tecnologias como o Deep Learning estão a ser desenvolvidas com o objetivo de alimentar esta dependência de ferramentas digitais. Wiener observou que nós, humanos, perante oportunidades atrativas, estamos dispostos a pagar um pequeno custo perante a possibilidade de aceder a novos poderes. E rapidamente ficamos tão dependentes das nossas novas ferramentas que perdemos a habilidade de prosperar sem elas. As opções tornam-se obrigatórias. Pensem nas nossas roupas. Comida cozinhada. Vitaminas. Vacinação. Cartões de crédito. Smartphones. internet e já hoje em dia a própria inteligência artificial. Portanto, o paradigma consiste em criar uma dependência humana de ferramentas digitais para manter este fluxo de dados gerado pela nossa utilização e alargar ainda mais esse fluxo a todos os aspectos da nossa vida. O Wiener também não previu a complexidade das plataformas atuais, nem o emaranhado legal associado aos termos de uso e consentimento. Hoje em dia, vivemos uma relação binária com estas plataformas e estes serviços. Ou consentimos a extração desta informação sobre nós próprios, sobre a nossa utilização, ou então não temos acesso a estes serviços. Nós somos capazes de aceitar contratos de utilização de serviços que, se nos fossem oferecidos por um outro humano cara a cara, nós rejeitaríamos sem pensar duas vezes. As grandes empresas tecnológicas têm-se alicerçado numa relação de poder cada vez mais desigual. Nós estamos a ser comoditizados por empresas que, paradoxalmente, desenvolvem serviços que nós queremos ter e precisamos, e ao mesmo tempo a nossa vida depende de sistemas computacionais que são vulneráveis a ataques externos. O Wiener afirmou que a longo prazo não há distinção entre criarmos armas para nós ou armas para os nossos inimigos. E hoje em dia, a idade da informação é também a idade da desinformação. Mais recentemente, a crise pandémica veio acelerar a adoção de tecnologias de vigilância por parte de vários Estados, que abrem o seu uso para potenciais fins totalitários no futuro. A primeira coisa que necessitamos para sair deste imbróglio é liderança moral. A União Europeia, de momento, não é capaz de competir na inovação da inteligência artificial com os Estados Unidos e com a China. Mas tem vindo a ser pioneira a definir boas práticas e a criar nova regulação para o uso responsável, tanto dos dados como da inteligência artificial. São iniciativas importantes, mas muitas vezes pecam por serem vagas e tecnocráticas. É fundamental que esta comissão, em particular a comissária Vestager, consiga passar das palavras aos atos e se foque na operacionalização concreta do modelo de governance para a inteligência artificial. E com isto termino a minha declaração inicial.
Ok, Pedro, muito obrigada pela intervenção. Eu agora passo a palavra à Chloe. Chloe, I'd like to ask you to basically also present yourself and what you do and your first initial remarks. Thank you.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Chloe Teven, and I'm a policy officer with the European Centre for Development Policy Management in Maastricht in the Netherlands. But we also have an office in Brussels and used to go there very regularly before current times. And I'm really working a lot on EU-Africa relations, but also on how the wider geopolitical context is shifting the way the European Union's own foreign policy, the way that the EU's foreign policy is being formulated. And I'm specifically looking now at digitalization and at the role of digitalization in European foreign and development policy. I think after Pedro's very, very interesting and stimulating introduction, I will end up in much the same place looking at European governance, but I'll come at it from a very different perspective, which is that of the geopolitical competition that we're seeing in the world today. And this is very much the US and China that are driving this competition, which we see across all kinds of different arenas, and most notably in the economic, but also in multilateral institutions. And the tech sphere is really the sector where it has been most fierce and where we're seeing the beginnings of what is becoming a deeper and deeper decoupling of the US and the Chinese economies. This has been most famously exemplified by the case of Huawei, with the US first banning Huawei in the US and then increasingly putting pressure on European countries and African countries and others around the world to ban Huawei. To date, very few have actually banned it. But what we see is very much that there's a decoupling happening between the digital actors and the internet as a whole, between these two great powers, with very different models being promoted by the US and China, and with each of them seeking allies to work alongside them. From a European perspective, there isn't really an interest in being in following one of these actors and in decoupling from the other. And so the EU has resisted the US's demands to decouple from China, but at the same time, we do see that there are perhaps more areas of agreement between the US and Europe than between China and Europe when it comes to internet governance in particular. But ultimately, the EU has its own geopolitical considerations and doesn't want to be caught between the two other actors. And this has led to a growing focus in the EU on what we're calling digital sovereignty. This comes as part of a bigger consideration around how the EU can be a more sovereign actor in the world, can have a stronger economy, can be a leader on the green transition, but also how the EU can develop its own governance model for the digital sphere that is that takes a fine balance between the surveillance capitalism of that very much comes from US big tech, and the state surveillance that is increasingly becoming evident in China and in some of its allies through the digital Silk Road. But so far, this model is very much in its early days. As Pedro mentioned, that there are very big aspirations, but so far, what we have seen with GDPR was a very important first step towards regulating personal data, but there will be many other questions to deal with in the months and years to come. One of the big initiatives that's expected in the coming months is the Digital Services Act, which is expected to also look into how online platforms deal with disinformation, and also look at competition and anti-competitive practices by some of these platforms, which leads us on to the other aspect of kind of the European approach, which to digital sovereignty, which is a growing focus on how can the EU actually have a stronger and more sovereign, a more vibrant tech sector of its own. Because when we think of the big tech actors in Europe, most of them are ultimately American companies, whilst China has created also its own national champions that now with apps such as yes, China is increasingly a global actor, and companies like Huawei have already got a global reach in terms of infrastructure. So with the Geopolitical Commission, Ursula von der Leyen made digital one of her top priorities, along with the Green Deal and climate change. And there's been a lot of very strong rhetoric around how Europe needs to become a leader on AI and quantum computing and all of these technologies of the future. But in the recently agreed multi-annual financial framework for the European Union's 7-year budget, which is the European Union 7-year budget, we haven't actually seen a huge amount of money put aside for digital. So this is going forward, it's going to be very important for the EU and its member states to actually work together towards not just strengthening governance, but also really investing in European digital innovation systems and in the European tech sector.
Okay. So thank you both for your intervention. I think they were both very insightful. And now I would like to start a debate. We already have one question in the Q&A, but I thought I could make the first question for each of you. So my first question is going to be for Pedro, and then my second question is going to be for Chloe. So Pedro, you told us about this Shoshana Zuboff surveillance capitalism. And also, I think she makes a parallel between surveillance capitalism and surveillance authoritarianism. And what came to my mind was that surveillance is not something new. I mean, it was used before, especially by authoritarian regimes. So it's something not new. So what is then so new about the use of these technologies for surveillance purposes? And more specifically, since you work in the ethics of artificial intelligence and so on, how can automated decision-making systems have an impact on liberal democracies and in the core values of our democracies?
Thank you for your question, Lara. I'll try to briefly kind of touch the 2 points you are raising here. So regarding the surveillance aspect, it's important to consider the scale of the surveillance we are witnessing today. So as I said in my first initial declaration about the smartphones being a Trojan horse for our privacy, it's really like that, because imagine the following: an individual has hundreds of interactions with smartphones every day. Social media, the interests we follow, political aspects, even our ideals of beauty, our diet, our fears regarding minorities, regarding the unknowns, regarding this even growing polarization, in terms that it's not just surveillance, it's also creating a filter bubble in which, because the business model is fed by personalization, because it's serving us with advertisement that is tailored for us, this makes technological companies develop ever growing personalized systems in which we just have access to reinforcement signals of what we already believe, of what are our views and our fears. And imagine this at the scale of how many millions of smartphones we have in the world right now. While before, this scale was much more on the range of the human capacities. If we have some sort of espionage or some sort of kind of a police enforcement in terms of totalitarian regimes of these types of political policies, that would be more on a human-based scale. And now we can simply automate that through our smartphones and our access to digital services. But that is not the case as of today, in the sense that as of today, we are being exploited just for lucrative purposes. What is really important is for us to be vigilant about the risk of, instead of being exploited for advertisement purposes, being exploited for political dissidents or authoritarianism kind of regimes. And the technology being there, the technology being deployed, that there is a risk. On the other hand, you are talking about using automated decision-making systems in the society, and now that can affect the democratic regime. It's also important to disconnect ourselves just from the AI that we get in our smartphones, but from the AI that is already being used in decision-making systems in various aspects of our lives. Many of you are not aware, but when you apply for a job, when you apply for an insurance policy, when you apply for a loan in a bank, there are already algorithmic risk assessment systems that use data to predict the risk of us defaulting and not paying a credit, the risk of us not having a very healthy lifestyle, and the risk of having some sort of disease, and so on and so forth. And there is a risk that by automating these decision-making systems, if there is not a governance model, as Chloe is mentioning as well, in which we make these systems a little bit more transparent, and we are aware of the biases and discrimination that these systems might produce, we might end up even widening the gap of the inequality gap between different groups in our population, and with all the risks that come with that. And in that regard, the democratic process might be at risk, because before it was not explicit what are the equality goals of a given public policy. By using AI for automated decision-making systems, we are making these implicit goals explicit, because now we can measure and we can have accountability on if the decision-making process of judges, of doctors, is somehow biased or not towards gender, towards race, towards age, and so on and so forth. So by being able to quantify these decision-making processes, we now have explicit definitions of what fair means. And our political agents must have an agenda, an open and transparent agenda of sharing with the citizens what are the equity goals and the fairness objectives of the public policy and the democratic process.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. I think it was an interesting response, especially also taking into account what Chloe already told us. So this idea that we need a model of governance. And you also mentioned the idea that the EU is good at, for example, regulation and practices, but that was quite vague when we look at the advantage that other superpowers already have, and especially the technological advantage they have. So I would ask to Chloe, of course, if Chloe wants to comment what you said, but also to give us an idea of how the EU could have an advantage in this competition, and especially an advantage in terms of promoting its values and defending the core values of liberal democracies. And how can the EU do it? For example, I don't know if it's through regulation or through the development of this digital sovereignty. So what's the plan of the EU to stand between these two superpowers?
Thank you. Well, this is very much, yes, this area of digital governance is an area where the EU really hopes to be able to build a model that also it can share with others. And there's a growing desire in Brussels to be seen as with the response to COVID, for example. The motto is really about a green, digital, and resilient Europe. That is the motto that the von der Leyen Commission and many of the European leaders are really espousing. And so it's this idea that Europe can be at the same time technologically savvy, but also have strong values that underpin its economic system. And this is an area where the EU really hopes to be a global leader. And actually, to date, there are already several countries around the world that have either copied the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, or that have integrated large parts of that data of the GDPR. So that includes countries like Japan, countries like Kenya in Africa. So it's very different countries, some very advanced, some developing countries with growing tech sectors. And this is really something that has been noticed in recent years, and that the EU wants to build on. Another concept that these days is quite popular in Brussels is the idea of the Brussels effect, which was coined by the legal scholar Anu Bradford, which talks about how ultimately through its regulation, the EU is already a regulatory superpower, and that companies, because the European Common Market is so is big and is is a market that most companies can't do without, they will comply with European regulation within the European market, but they may actually also just decide that it's easier to use the European regulation across the board because it's ultimately already learning to comply with it within the European case. Mm-hmm. And so there's a hope that this will also be another way for the EU to indirectly influence how the digital sector operates around the world. And as I work specifically on EU-Africa relations, this has been really one of the areas that the EU hopes to build a strong partnership with the African Union and with African countries on. And there are quite a lot of African scholars who are pointing to what they call digital colonialism, whereby the AI that they're using is all developed in Western countries. The companies that they turn to are all Western companies. And so there's very little that is actually coming from within Africa and that actually represents their values. And this is an area where the EU and the African Union have been working together, and where the EU hopes that it can have an important influence. But at the same time, it is important to note that in Africa, China, Google, Facebook, Chinese companies like Huawei, as well as Google and Facebook, are important investors who are building a lot of the basic infrastructure that is bringing digital technologies and the internet to more and more parts of Africa.
Okay, so thank you, Chloe. Well, I also have, following this debate, I have some more questions for you too, but I guess we can start with the Q&A questions. So basically, I think there's a question that was already answered, which was how can Europe help new AI champions? So I think we already discussed it a bit, so I'm going to read this one. And also the second one, which is, why do European tech companies have such a hard time competing in the world stage compared with the US ecosystem? Could strengthen private policies in the common market be used to set world standards for privacy. Sorry. Just like what is done with physical goods. So I can read this one again. So could strengthen privacy policies in the common market be used to set world standards for privacy, just like what is done with physical goods? I'm not sure if any of you has anything.
Well, I think that very much is what I was just speaking about in terms of the Brussels effect. But it might be worth speaking a little bit more about what those strengthened policies might be. And I think Pedro might also have some ideas in terms of where European governance around AI should go, because this is a debate that's really now raging, but I'd be very interested personally to hear more from Pedro also on that.
Sure. Now is more about really understanding where we are and what's coming next. So GDPR was released a couple of years ago, and as Chloe said, it really created this new gold standard of regulation. And I've talked and interact with many different people around the world. And in the US, companies are really aware of GDPR. And I have colleagues in US that they know GDPR because they operate in the EU market. And as Chloe said, it's probably easier sometimes to just adopt a kind of across the border policy in terms of regulation than have a specific systems in place for EU and different systems in place outside the EU. But EU now is planning on the next step in terms of regulation, which is not on the data, but on the AI governance itself. And EU released earlier this year a white paper on AI, and the industry is expecting new regulation, a new bill on AI regulation in early 21. This new regulation will be based on the concept of risk, which requires the different actors to assess what is the risk for natural and legal persons' rights and freedoms. And based on this assessment of risk, then different procedures will be applied to make sure that there is an impact assessment of AI. And what this impact assessment is expected to be? Is expected to be based on, first of all, data provenance. So where is this data being used coming from? Was there consent in the use of this data? Secondly, the risks in terms of robustness, in terms of resilience, in terms of attacks, to kind of adversarial attacks. And one thing that is really important to stress, and also because it's my area of interest particularly, is EU is putting on the table the condition for anti-discrimination. But it's still not clear how this anti-discrimination will be assessed and operationalized, in the sense that it's expected that companies, when developing AI and performing these impact assessments, to be aware how the decision-making systems that they are developing with AI would impact different groups of the population based on age, based on ethnicity, based on nationality, and so on and so forth. And I really believe that's a crucial step in this impact assessment. And what are the risks I see in terms of this new regulation? It's the same as GDPR. GDPR is rather vague often. Is expected to be self-regulated in the sense that is the actors that are responsible to the DPOs and to make sure that they have the best practice in place, so they are compliant. And then once in a while, it might happen that there is some sort of audit understanding what is going on. And this paradigm of making somehow the self-regulation in practice might not be very robust to malpractices and to misuse in terms of these different companies. And we have seen in the financial sector that self-regulation often goes a little bit sour. So I'm very curious to understand if, besides just proposing regulation, which is with intentions, if EU is going one step further and really making sure, I know that it's very hard to be too prescriptive, but making sure that there is bodies and entities that can also regulate, kind of an external and not partisan bodies can assess the impact of these AIs and not let external entities, private entities, to make sure that their systems are compliant or not.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Pedro. I don't know if you wish to add something, Chloe, but I was just thinking about what Chloe told us, that that the European Union wants to be a regulatory superpower. So I was wondering if that would be enough, if EU can bet on regulation without technically developing its scientific investigation in the field of AI, or the more technical aspects for trying to compete with other superpowers in this field. So is regulation enough for Europe's strategy? And I was thinking about it because Chloe mentioned that the EU doesn't want to go either with the US or China. And I was wondering if the fields of security and defense, and usually the traditional European countries' alliances, especially with the US, if this domain of security and defense and of alliances especially with the US, if it is now conflicting with the technological options that the European Union and the countries inside the European Union are taking. So, for example, when a country decides to choose technological, yes, when a country wants to choose for technological infrastructure, if it has to take into account the fields of security and defense, and if it is now more relevant than it was in the past, or if, what do you think about that?
Yes, absolutely. So to answer on there were sort of two questions there. The first being, this question of the fact that the EU traditionally has been very much allied with the US and actually dependent on the US in terms of security and defense. But what we are seeing in terms of the transatlantic alliance, I think that it's no secret that there are issues there, notably in terms of the US trade war on Europe, alongside deep disagreements about multilateralism and how we approach the rules-based international order, how we, work together at the Security Council and with others, so at the WTO, etc. So there are many issues there which are part of the reason that the EU is now increasingly focusing on this idea of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. And actually the European Council this weekend will be discussing in more detail this idea of strategic autonomy and how to strengthen the single market as a whole. And so within that, the digital sector is one amongst many sectors. But as you mentioned, it's also a sector which overlaps with security concerns. And so the Trump administration does have security concerns that underline, that have motivated the ban on Huawei and now on TikTok, that there are real concerns about China actually using its infrastructure and its companies in order to ultimately using these as tools for surveillance in Western democracies, which are unanswered. And there have been different assessments that have said different things. The European Union has come up with its own strategy, which ultimately says that risky service providers, it doesn't actually mention Huawei, but it talks about service providers that pose a security risk, that they will not be used in certain critical parts of our infrastructure. So there will be, as we build our 5G infrastructure, Huawei is being used in quite a lot of countries across the EU. But when it comes to the most risky and in need of deeper, those parts that are in need of deeper security, that it will be basically kept out. But this was the approach that the UK was originally taking, and then the UK actually decided to change course and follow the US. So it's a complicated and evolving strategy, and it seems very likely that the EU will eventually move away from using Huawei because of security concerns. And there are a lot of people who know a lot more about the technical aspect than I do, who have been advising that that would be a good idea. At the same time, it's actually the EU that has been that pushed the US to join it in creating a global partnership on artificial intelligence, together with other democracies like New Zealand and Japan. So it's the G7 and several other democracies that have created this alliance, which doesn't agree on a huge amount, but its mission statement, which was its first meeting was in June, and its mission statement does talk about human-centered AI and about democratic values, human rights. So it's very, very vague, but it is an initial attempt to have the Western democracies and or the democratic countries in general join together around a shared vision for AI. Which some have suggested is something of an anti-China alliance ultimately when it comes to AI.
So you could possibly say that it's vague, but it's exciting, definitely.
I think it will have a lot more potential if the President of the United States were to change in November.
So Pedro, any remark on that?
Not more on the aspect of if regulation is the way to go in terms of kind of taking the lead. It's just a very small kind of comment. It's about it. In the end, it probably won't be enough. In the sense that, as we have seen. Training very large deep learning models is becoming more and more expensive. The computational infrastructure to train these huge AI models is mostly in the US and in China, not in Europe. And there is becoming to start a new business model in terms of one single entity is responsible and has resources to train these huge AI models, and then they sell access to these AI through services, which in the long run might represent that European companies that rely on AI to enhance their services and their products will pay rent to US companies to kind of exploit these AI capabilities. And that was my small remark.
Okay, so, well, thank you very much. Well, we have one more question from the audience. And I would like to join this question with the final remarks, because we only have 10 minutes until we end. And the panels today, the first one was about fear and the second one was about inequality. And like, it's kind of interesting that at the end we end up speaking about these two concepts, but from a different perspective. And there was an idea that came out of this panel. It was that technology is not neutral. And there was a suggestion by one of the speakers that anytime we develop technology, many voices should be heard, so that it doesn't have such an implicit bias, or it's not only developed by certain people, that it has to have plurality in the way it's built. And well, that I thought it was an interesting remark, and I would like to hear your opinion on that. And also add just a more concise question from a participant, which is, why is the 5G technology such a political question? So if you could give us a final remark related with that.
I'd probably lead to Chloe the 5G discussion, and probably I'll take the first one if Chloe allows it. Absolutely. When we are dealing with data, when we are building our models, the current paradigm is a black box. People just use this huge amount of data. They have an efficiency goal, an utilitarian goal, and when the AI achieves this goal, it is ready to go to production, without taking into account second characteristics as discrimination, as I said before. So if these new technologies are being developed, if different stakeholders are being heard in the process, and when I mean different stakeholders, is not just different in terms of different backgrounds, it's also about different education, different training, especially the humanities. These large and huge kind of large impact decisions should not be reserved to mere technical kind of profiles. Often these are political decisions that are people better off equipped to contribute to these decisions. So lots of people from philosophy, ethics, and humanities should be taken into consideration, but more important, the communities, the subjects that are going to be affected by this AI should be heard. So communities, not just majority groups, but also minority groups, should be taken into account when deciding what is the fairness goal, what are the fairness objectives, what are the utilitarian objectives, what would be the impact, what is the cost or the harm of an error of AI in these different communities. So I'm totally aligned with this different panel, and I'm really a champion for inclusion and diversity as a requirement to develop AI that is fair and non-discriminatory.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. So now, Chloe, you work in governance, what do you think about what we said? And if you could conclude as a final remark.
Well, yesterday, actually, Margaret Vestager, the Vice President of the Commission in charge of digital, actually on a panel said, can you imagine if rather than, men in their 20s and 30s, that the technology we use today had been developed by women of my age, it would look very different in terms of the sorts of technology that we would have available to us. And it was a funny point. She suggested there would be lots of yoga apps and things about life-work balance and childcare. So I thought it was an interesting remark, and certainly points to the importance of having a kind of diversity of people working on these questions. I was also struck by, I'm sure many people have watched The Social Dilemma in the last few weeks, and watching it, I was very struck by the the lack of diversity in terms of, you know, these are the people working in Silicon Valley, and all of the women that are brought in are pretty much all from academia or are analysts rather than actually working in Silicon Valley, which again just points to, you know, to the kind of sameness that the sector currently has. But on the question of 5G, well, there are many reasons why it's very political. Here in the Netherlands, there are many people who are burning down masts because of, you know, their political beliefs. But in terms of the geopolitics, the reason it's so political is because Huawei is by far the biggest provider of this technology. It provides it much, much cheaper than any of the alternative companies. The alternative companies are European companies, but for most, even across Europe, rolling it out, the decision to go with Ericsson, for example, where it would be much more expensive is a tough decision to make. And that's part of the reason that, and then for countries in Africa, for example, it's a no-brainer. You go with those that can provide it as cheaply as possible. But this has meant that Huawei has a near monopoly when it comes to, or did previously at least have a near monopoly when it came to rolling out this technology. And the US was afraid that ultimately the whole world would be dependent on China for this technology. So there's a big geopolitical concern behind that. That's pretty much it.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes before the end of this session, so I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I think we could be speaking for another hour. There were still questions that could not be answered, and I thank you, Pedro and Chloe and Clube de Lisboa, and now I pass the word to Fernando, which is closing the session and also closing the day. Obrigada a todos.